What other purposes might Paul have had in mind in writing this letter? Let me give you two more, and this will wrap up today's discussion. One of the other purposes would have been to gain support for his ministry and the gospel he proclaimed. According to Romans 15, verses 18 through 24, Paul has finished his work in a certain area and wants to do missions work further west. Let me read to you from Romans 15, verses 18 through 24. Paul writes, "For I will not be so bold as to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me to win obedience from the Gentiles by word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit. So that," here's where he starts to lay out the area, "from Jerusalem and as far around as Illyricum, I have fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ. Thus, I make it my ambition to proclaim the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, so that I do not build on someone else's foundation. But as it is written, those who have never been told of him shall see, and those who have never heard of him shall understand." In other words, all right, I think I've covered this area, so now I want to go on to a new area. "This then," verse 22, "is the reason that I have so often been hindered from coming to you. But now, with no further place for me in these regions, I desire, as I have for many years, to come to you when I go to Spain. For I do hope to see you on my journey, and to be sent on by you once I have enjoyed your company for a little while." So notice what Paul has said there. He's laid out this area, and if you look at it on a map, you can almost draw a somewhat circular shape when you trace the areas that Paul mentions there. And he said, I basically covered this area. I don't think Paul is suggesting that every inhabitant of the area had heard the message, but he has evangelized enough major areas where he can be confident that the churches he's established will now spread into the surrounding regions. So enough bases have been touched that those who are there can carry on and finish the work. And what Paul wants to do now is go on to a new area, namely Spain. And so he tells the Romans, I've always wanted to visit you, but this is why I keep getting hindered. I've got to finish my work in that area. But now I'm done with the work. And so I can finally visit you on my way to Spain. It's like two things he really wants to do. He really wants to visit the Romans, and he really wants to go to Spain. So he's going to hit the Romans on the way to Spain. And geographically, Spain is quite a distance from Paul's ministry base in Antioch. If you read the book of Acts 13, everything starts in Antioch. Spain's pretty far away from that. And so what Paul would love to have, and he said it in those last verses I read, is he would love to have the Roman Christians support his ministry in the West. So that's what he's telling them. I'm on my way, friends, and I'm going to fulfill this long desire to visit you. But even that is with a view to something greater. I want to stop on my way and gain your support before I go on to do this work in Spain. Now let me ask you this, friend. When someone comes to your church and wants you to support them as a missionary or a Christian worker or what have you, what's one of the first questions you normally have? Who are you, and can I trust you? What do you preach, and what are you trying to do? And does it align with what I think you should be doing as a Christian worker or minister? Well, guess what? The Roman church probably had the same questions. And in order to gain that trust, Paul details for his readers in Romans the gospel he preaches. so they can know that he is a reliable messenger. And so the content of Romans really becomes for Paul his presence with them until he can get there, and the manifestation, the statement of his theology in the gospel he preaches, so that they will trust him to do missions work and give him their support. And so that's why Romans does lend itself to the kind of study that seeks to say, okay, what is the essence of the Christian faith? Or perhaps even more focused on Romans' stated purpose or theme, which we'll come to soon, what is the gospel? What are the essentials of the gospel? Which gospel truths lead to unity in the church? And so on which truths should we unify and build and find our Christian witness? Romans really becomes a great guidebook for gospel unity and tells us how to recognize the people of God. And so this goes back to a question we raised when we looked at Romans 14 and 15. You know, we should welcome one another and not dispute over matters of indifference or non-essential matters. And we have to ask, okay, well, what constitutes essential and disputable matters? Romans somewhat gives us a clue. The topics that Paul develops in Romans are themselves a suggested answer to that question. Here's the essentials of the gospel. Here's what I'll be saying in Spain. Here's what you'll be supporting if you give me your support as I go on to Spain. Here's the Christian message. Now, I got to put a slight footnote on that. There are some topics that Paul does not speak to in Romans in great detail that other books might still tell us, hey, this is kind of important when it comes to the Christian faith. So I don't want to be reductionistic and, like I said earlier, act like the rest of the Bible doesn't matter. Let's not do that. But as we're always trying to weigh, as we're always trying to be discerning about what is at the center of the Christian faith, I do think Romans gives us some good guidance in that. And Paul's stated purpose here gives us the clue to justify that he would write this letter so they would support him on his way to Spain. So then if you circle back to our earlier statement about Romans and systematic theology, this purpose, to build trust, to lay out the gospel, this explains why Paul writes a letter that is so long and so systematic in its presentation. It does tell a story, and we'll overview that story in the different sections of Romans. And it does have a very rooted historical purpose. I've been laboring to establish that. But it is also chock full of doctrinal content, and that for good reason. Without these truths, there is no story. These truths are the foundation that Paul builds on to tell his gospel story and accomplish these gospel purposes. As one resource writes, Romans is not exactly a systematic theology, though it offers vast resources for such a project. It is more of an apostolic testament. In telling the Roman church how he understood the gospel, Paul leaves behind almost a formal record of how he had come to understand his own vocation. And so Romans is the most wide-ranging theological statement of Paul's views, displayed not as a list of topics to be discussed, but as a single, though many-sided, argument for a scripturally shaped vision of the church and its mission. In other words, there is just something organic about the book of Romans that has a heartbeat in the gospel. That's what makes Romans tick, as one older essay wrote, trying to answer that question. What makes Romans tick? It's got a central story. It's got a very real historical purpose, but it's also a just well laid out coherent statement of Paul's gospel that was intended to solve these problems. And in coming discussions, we'll give more attention to that theme, to that heartbeat that holds it all together. But one last purpose then for Paul's writing of this letter.